Welcome to Media Diversity Institute's interview with Eric Heinze, a professor of law and humanities at Queen Mary University of London, a renowned scholar in legal philosophy, justice theory, law and politics, free speech, and human rights. All of the important things he's researching and writing about. He's authored several books on these topics. Today, he joins us to discuss his latest book, Coming Clean: The Rise of Critical Theory and the Future of the Left, and much more. Welcome, Eric.
It's my pleasure to be with you, Rini.
So I'll jump right to it. Your book critiques contemporary critical theory. I wondered if you could explain to us what critical theory is so that the audience is familiar with the concept, and also what inspired you to write Coming Clean.
Well, critical theory is not an easy thing to define because there are many branches of it. I guess you could say, if you wanted to keep things very basic, it's sort of what came after Marxism, although there are still plenty of people who are very much engaged in the Marxist tradition. Um, but sort of, I guess, around the mid 20th century, we started getting very new waves. Of broadly leftist or progressive thought, coming out of anti-racist struggles, anti-colonial struggles, feminism, LGBTQ plus rights, and so forth, and other movements as well, more recently environmentalism or even animal welfare. And so there's no one thing known as critical theory. It's loads of different ideas that come together. Um, Although a lot of them have been focused on the dominance of Western civilization over the past few centuries, and have tended to link those problems to an understanding of the ways in which power has been deployed by Western civilization.
And why did you choose to write this book, Coming Clean?
I chose to write it because I think that all of these different strands of thinking are very, very important. They've raised essential issues about justice. In many ways, they've defined the ways in which we talk and debate about justice in our world today. However, I think that one of the most crucial elements of critical theory has always been that those who do it also need to be able to critique themselves, right? So in teaching the rest of us, right, how to critique our society, they have always promised that they were also critiquing themselves and their own engagements. And I think that there's been a problem with that. In fact, and I think this is in particular a problem that has arisen around leftist politics. Generally speaking, leftist progressives will acknowledge mistakes or problems on the left, going back over 100 years or so, looking at commitments to totalitarian regimes, dictatorial regimes, repressive regimes. But we rarely get very far beyond simple acknowledgements. We don't get the kind of mass campaigns that progressives and leftists ask us to do for about Western liberal democracy. And so then it becomes very unclear, well, what do they mean then by self-criticism? If they're not if they're not doing the same kind of open and constant and candid self-criticism that they ask everyone else to do, then what is it that they mean when they tell us that they're doing their own self-criticism and that this justifies them in asking the rest of us to do it as well?
So that's what you mean by coming clean. You want the left to, okay.
Yet
Do you
essentially to do what it rightly asks everyone else to do.
do you think that critical theory and coming clean, as you say, do you see that a lot happening in media and journalism in today's world? We have misinformation, we have, AI dominance. How do you see coming clean and sort of talking about the left, like you said, with a sort of self-critical view? How do you see that playing out in journalism?
Very little. I think what we get in the mass media today are just culture wars, right? So you'll have some people sticking out leftist positions, and then the only real criticism comes then just from a kind of arch opposite right wing, right, who just wants to bash them, and so the level remains very, very low, and at best they just ignore each other, right? This is some I do not think that the left should be so reactive, just waiting for the criticisms to come from the right and them either responding or ignoring, right? I think that the left has to be far more proactive, again, in acknowledging 100, more than 100 years of constant strands of leftist support for repressive regimes, which have resulted in countless millions of victims, either deaths or simply destroyed lives, destroyed families. Again, the very things that leftists are rightly concerned about when they're looking to critique Western liberal democracy, right? So we have all of these, and in particular, again, the left has rightly told us to engage with our history, to do that critically, and yet we have all of these histories of atrocities that leftists have, in one way or another, stood behind or lent legitimacy to, even if they later apologized, right? That again, that they're not proactive in engaging about, right? I mean, after all, right, in the West we have many people, politicians, governments, and so far, and so and so forth, who will sincerely apologize for histories of slavery, or apologize for histories of racial discrimination, or sexism, or what have you. But for leftists, that is seen as that's not enough. Just to apologize, just to acknowledge it. We have to actively educate the public. And they're right about that. But then why don't they do this as a means of practicing what they call their own self-critique? Where is that? We don't see that in the media. Instead, all we see in the media are just the rather banal culture wars.
And do you have examples of this in your book when you talk about the left sort of not looking at their history? Does your book discuss it?
Yeah, I do cite several examples. One of the examples I start with is the Ukraine war.
Mm.
Here again, we have there's no one leftist position on the Ukraine war. We have to, in fact, there's probably no one leftist position on anything. Again, but I do, try to look for, strands, currents, and I did find, some people on the left, essentially just ignore it, right? As if it's just a kind of marginal conflict, right? Um, and others will condemn it, but that's it. Just in the way, we'll get every now and then, a condemnation of Stalinism or a condemnation of Mao's Cultural Revolution. So you'll get the kind of pat condemnation, but nothing that doesn't go any further. There's no sense of the need for the left to actively take account of, the ways in which, for again a good century, leftists were actively lending legitimacy to, if not actively supporting, regimes in the Kremlin and in Beijing and, in other very repressive regimes. And indeed, as to Ukraine, we do even find some who essentially just take Russia's side, right? You'll always get a sentence or two saying, oh, yes, the invasion was terrible. And then that's it. It just stops there, right? Although it's unthinkable that we would say, well, yes, slavery in the West was terrible, and then we move on to the next topic. That would be seen as outrageous, right? And so, I start with the Ukraine war, and then I go on to a few other examples. Another example I use, for example, is the treatment of LGBTQ plus people, although predominantly gay males, under Castro's Cuba. Noting how, again, we find, leftists who have commented on it, blaming it on essentially everything and everyone except Castro, right? And Castro himself made a kind of, deathbed confession, and then that's kind of it. It just stops there. Why? Why? In other words, why would it be that all the rest of us need to be constantly, teaching and remembering and commemorating and getting and going into training programs? And again, I don't condemn any of that, but that again, the very people who do this teaching and run those programs don't seem to think it's necessary for, again, hundreds of millions of victims over the last century or so, of atrocities in which the Western left was to some degree complicit. And incidentally, I do underscore here that the book is largely about the Western left. Clearly, we have leftist movements outside the West, and often with very different histories. So there again, you can't just generalize about the West, and I don't want to do that. Nevertheless, the Western left has been quite formative, quite seminal in in shaping more generally what is considered to be progressive thinking and progressive politics in our time.
That's so interesting because I do think about the rest of the world and how left is viewed in other parts of the world. This brings me to my next question. I was thinking about you talk about wokeness and a new kind of wokeness in your book, and I'm really curious to know what that is and if you can give us a little bit a sneak peek about what that is. So then,
Well,
yeah.
and there again, I mean, I guess we all know by now that woke was only ever a rather casual, offhand, um, very loose term, and I guess some people would be surprised to see that it has generated right so much attention and so much controversy when I think it was never meant to carry such weight. Nevertheless, we have it. And there again, we see that it's the kind of term that just sparks extremes of polarization, right? You're either woke or you're anti-woke, right? As if the label has to be on your forehead. And that's why I'm saying no, I'm not anti-woke, although I'm critical of the left. What I'm arguing for is a kind of a new woke, a different woke, right? For what we're calling wokeness, whatever that is, to again to start practicing more of the self-critique that leftists have always told us that they do, but which is very hard to see with the same passion, the same commitment, with which we're taught the histories of Western atrocities and Western wrongdoings, and again, rightly taught those.
Yeah. You are calling for more self-introspection, which I think is true. Given what's happening in the world right now, and because we're a Media Diversity Institute, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about the left movements and your critique of it, or I would say an introspection of it, and how we can look at the pillar of democracy, which is inclusion, and looking at the marginalized. How would you see that?
And I guess I would see if we really want to look at where the left has been, say, in the last decade or two, however, right? And we see this now very much with all of these right-wing reactions, whether it's the election of Donald Trump or the right-wing movements going on in greater or lesser degrees in Britain, in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands, in much of Europe, in Italy, in Spain. Let's face it, a lot of that has been reactions against identity politics. And there again, we end up with these kind of extreme polarization. Either you're for identity politics or you're against it, as if there are no other possibilities. And here again, I'm looking for a very different approach. I think I don't think in principle there's anything so wrong with identity politics. I think its basic impulse to draw our attention to long, important, and grievous histories of oppression. Of course, this is important if you care about justice at all. But again, I think if over the past few decades, this had been presented to us by people who were at the same time and for the same lengths of time, willing also to teach us about their own implication, their own histories, right? And I literally do mean equal time. I mean, fine, we can allow 5 minutes on one side or the other, but again, in other words, fundamentally equal. I think identity politics would have been much more accepted, right? But I think some people find it simply unbearable to be hectored about history by people who don't seriously and publicly and openly, with the same candor that they expect of us, talk about the histories with which their own movements have been affiliated, right? For again, however good the intentions were, right? I think that if we go back, a century or so, if we look at Western leftists who were supporting Bolshevism, or even Stalin, or Mao, or Castro, or Chavez, or you name it, I think the intentions were often good. I have no doubt about that. And I think, whether we like it or not, the intentions were often good behind many Western forms of oppression, right? If we start getting into intentions, we never really get to any serious understanding of problems. People have the intentions that are largely framed by the possibilities and the limitations of their own time. Right. And so, of course, leftists in the 20th century would have had very different understandings of the world than, say, colonialists of the 19th century or revolutionaries of the 18th century and so forth. We're all products of our time with all those limitations, right? And so you can find all sorts of people who have been involved in horrible things or have benefited from them with good intentions, right? And so I have no doubt that much of what's gone on the left has been done with good intentions, but no one on the left ever thought that good intentions excuses anything. So why would it excuse what the left itself has done?
So, do you think that identity politics is then not helpful to the marginalized?
I think, as I say, I think identity politics have a place. I understand it. I think, again, I don't for a moment question the intentions behind it. To make us aware of, and wherever possible to redress, long histories of oppressive treatment. So the point is not, in my view, to get rid of identity politics, not least because not at all clear to me what people think would take its place,
Mm,
um, but rather to inscribe identity politics within a much larger understanding of oppression in history,
yeah.
oppression you know which has always taken place, right, and often on a mass scale. It's not only the West that has perpetrated mass injustice, mass brutality, mass violence, mass killing, right?
Yes.
And we just don't see on the left any of this public and open and candid self-scrutiny of the at the order of which that same scrutiny is expected of us, of everyone else. And that
Yeah.
just has to change. When that changes, I'm happy. I think identity politics can very much stay in place, and again, will be more effective. It will be more appreciated because it will be delivered to us by people who show from the outset that they understand and also want to teach about the kinds of oppression in which the left itself, the Western left itself, has always been complicit up to this very day.
Yeah. Do you see the role of journalists in sort of shaping and having that sort of self scrutiny that you are now talking about? Do you see the role of the media and journalists in this?
I do. Here again, take the example of the Ukraine war. Um, you can you'll get either sort of left-leaning journalists. They're not all left-leaning, but many,
Yeah.
right? Who say, who will give you, who will in a sentence or two tell you, oh yes, Putin's invasion was terrible, and then for the next 10 pages, how it's all the fault of the West and everything the West has done wrong, right? Or on the right, you'll get the opposite, right? How just the relentless focus on Putin, right, without even considering what the West might have done differently, right? And I wonder if many journalists think that these are the only two options.
So lazy almost.
Well, I think all of us can fall into these habits. We look at, you write about, yeah, I'm not a journalist, but if I were, I guess I would also look around and how is this being covered and whom do I agree with and so forth. So, I'm not really blaming anybody. But here again, I think it's, just like the cultural wars generally, these issues so easily polarize into really simplistic options as if there are no others.
So there is a lack of nuance, you think, in reporting about Ukraine or, for example, the Middle East. because journalists are sort of, like you said, it's easier to go to something that everyone else is talking about rather than, and maybe we need to call for that, is what I'm hearing from you.
And well, and I guess you see another problem, right? It's it's just unfortunately, at least in right now, as things now stand, this old problem of clickbait,
Yes.
right? Like
Yes.
we know, and as soon as anybody starts to take a more kind of reflective and nuanced uh, position, we know that they're not going to get many clicks. What gets clicks are stark positions. It's the fault of X. That's
Yes.
what gets clicks.
Yes.
And I'm not sure I know how to resolve that, right? Because I think many people have been looking for ways out of that, right? So we do see some websites which do, for example, try to take a subtler view of current affairs, and often they don't get a lot of traction. We can, so we can, we can kind of keep fighting that good fight. But yeah, it's tough. We're up against something formidable when it's people like Elon Musk, right? Who are kind of dictating the sort of the media that many people see, which is always just about all or nothing, good or bad, right or wrong. This very simplistic way of looking at very complicated problems.
True. Given, MDI's strong belief in inclusive debate being a foundation of democracy, what advice would you give to an organization like ours? We are, relentlessly working towards identity being inclusive in the media, online, offline. Do you have any advice for organizations like us?
Um, yes. Who have you left out? And that wouldn't be a criticism of MDI any more than many other organizations, right? Again, an organization like MDI, I understand why it's had the focus that it's had, and I think it's done fantastic work. Um, but then this leads us to the question, well, why, who has been left out and why? Again, I think because of MDI's sort of particular affinity, not exclusive, but particular affinity with Central and Eastern Europe. Um, I think there's an understanding that if you start doing too much criticism of the left or of leftist histories, then you start playing the game of nationalists. And as we know, extremist nationalism is a horrendous problem in Eastern and Central Europe, right? It's toxic. And so I can understand, right? And a lot of it, right? If you go back to sort of the immediate Cold War period, excuse me, the years immediately after the Cold War, sort of 1990s, turn of the century, as these nationalist and right-wing movements began to emerge in Central and Eastern Europe, often they sort of pitched their view of the world by attacking the whole sort of socialist tradition, which they could just easily brand as leftist, and so they started to own that. Right. So critique of the left, again, already that was kind of owned by the right. And so you didn't, so no one on the left wanted to do this kind of open criticism of that whole socialist history because that would just be playing the game of the right. But that's just wrong. You have to be able to do that. And in fact, how you distinguish yourself then from the right is you can continue to do the identity politics,
Mm.
right? So you can, yes yes we can criticize the histories of Leninism and Stalinism and Maoism and Castro and Chavez and all of the the truly heinous kind of repression that we've seen. But we can still, but we can still also care about racial discrimination and colonization and LGBTQ plus and so forth, right? It's not like you could you and and yet it's so hard to find organizations or media outlets that will do both. It's almost as if you're not allowed to do both. If you're taking one set of positions, that precludes the other. And this is where I think progressive thinkers can really start to change direction. They can be much more open, much more candid about the histories of leftist oppression without giving up, and in fact, thereby strengthening the more traditionally leftist commitments, strengthening them by making more credible, more plausible, less hypocritical.
Yes. Well, Well, thank you so much. This was such a great chat, and I'm sure everyone I know who is looking forward to reading your book. Thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you very much, Rini. Good luck
All
with
right.
everything.
Thank you.
Take care.